This is an interview for the Oklahoma Living Legends program with with Mrs. Cathelene Watson, a retired school teacher from Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Bob Rothe is making the interview of Oklahoma City. The interview is being made in Okmulgee the 12th day of August, 1976. Ms. Watson, would you give me your full name and spell it, please?
Cathelene Watson, that's Cathelene. Watson, Watson.
Okay. Now, you're reporting today on Reverend J.M Littlejohn, your father, I understand. So if you'll just tell us some of the things that you think are interesting to the group about Reverend Littlejohn, and again, would you spell his name for us?
My father, Reverend J.M Littlejohn. Littlejohn is Littlejohn. Reverend Littlejohn was a typical small-town preacher in eastern Oklahoma. He surrendered to the call to the ministry in 1921 and became an itinerant minister in the Methodist Church. At the time he entered the ministry, he gave up a good job as manager of a company store at Phillips, Oklahoma. For the next 30 years, he pastored 17 different small-town churches such as Dustin, Red Oak, Caddo, Haskell, and Salina. His first charge was at OK, Oklahoma. My father, mother, and 3 children moved into a 3-room upstairs apartment at OK. He often had trouble paying the rent on even that apartment. The congregation was small and times were hard. Sometimes he was paid in corn, potatoes, chicken, or whatever produce the members had. There were days when we had nothing to eat for breakfast but bread and flour gravy, and sometimes for the other meals we had only boiled dry beans. After that first year, he usually preached in churches where a parsonage was provided for the minister. However, his income was always small, and his lack of college education prevented his rising in the ranks to a better paying bracket. Dad moved about every 2 years. At moving time, we packed all our belongings in boxes and hired a cattle truck to transport us. My brothers and I soon learned that we were PKs, preacher's kids, and that a different standard of conduct was expected of us. We were not permitted to attend picture shows, go to dances, or play cards. Smoking cigarettes or drinking was unthinkable. However, I have never regretted my strict upbringing. Over the years, we had some very unusual experiences. Once, when Dad was preaching at Canadian, Oklahoma, the Ku Klux Klan paid a surprise visit to one of the services. We were engaged in a quiet Sunday night service when the door suddenly burst open. About 30 robed and hooded Klansmen entered and filed silently down the aisle, forming a line across the front. All of us in the congregation were shaking with fright. The leader made a short talk in which he declared their belief in Jesus Christ and the church. Then he handed Dad a $25 donation, after which they all filed silently out. The service continued without any further mention of the interruption. There were many happy occasions, such as the pounding given to the new preacher by his congregation. The members would all gather at the parsonage or at the church and bring gifts of food, clothing, or toilet articles which they knew the preacher and his family would be needing. The revival meetings were the high point of the year. They were held during the summer while the crops were laid by and the children were on vacation from school. The evangelists were usually specialists who traveled about and conducted revivals in various churches. Sometimes Dad was invited to preach for revivals in other churches. Revivals were usually held in the churchyard, often under brush arbors. My brothers became excellent song leaders, and I played the piano for revivals from the time I was 9 years old. Revivals times were the happiest times of the year. Everyone was kinder, friendlier, and more cheerful. Dad was an old-time Holy Spirit preacher. Once, while holding revival, he became so much under the power of the Spirit that he fell to the floor in a trance. After a few moments, people began to ask what they could do to revive him. Mother said, "Just leave him alone. He will be okay." In a few minutes, he revived and came up shouting. He jumped over the communion rail and ran up and down the aisle shouting and praising God. The next day, there were rumors circulating around town that wild man down at the Methodist church. However, there came out of that meeting the largest number of converts that Dad ever made in any revival. Traveling preachers like Dad seldom own any furniture. The parsonage stoves, beds, mattresses, dressers, and so forth were donated by the congregation. They were usually cast-off things which the members had left after buying new furniture for themselves. At one of the charges where we served, a leading lady gave us a mattress. After using it for a few nights, we discovered that the mattress was infested with bed bugs. Dad took the mattress out in the backyard, saturated it with kerosene, and set fire to it. While the bonfire was blazing, our benefactor passes by and saw what was fueling the fire. Needless to say, she really got her dander up. At one charge where Dad served, it became his unpleasant duty to conduct a church trial. This was a practice which has since been discontinued by the Methodist Church. Several members of the congregation appeared before Dad and filed written charges against a certain man and a certain woman, both members of the church, charging them with adultery. Since Dad was the minister, he was obliged to conduct the trial and preside at the hearings. After a heated trial, the man and woman were both found guilty and expelled from the church. Dad often said in later years that this was the most unpleasant experience of his ministry. Most of the time we lived in furnished parsonages in the small town where Dad preached. Some of these had indoor plumbing and some did not. Frequently he was required to take a 2 or 3 point work. The extra charges were generally in rural communities several miles away. Dad seldom had any means of transportation of his own. Sometimes he could hitch rides out to his rural charges, and sometimes he walked. The greatest hardship on preachers' children was that of having to move during the school term. In those days, the annual conference was held in October, and preachers had to move the following week. The children would find ourselves in a new school, often taking different subjects and being 6 weeks behind. Once when Dad was packed to move from Dustin to Prague, it came a terrific rain so that all roads leading into and out of Dustin was flooded. The cattle truck that was supposed to come for us couldn't get to Dustin. The roads remained unusable for a week. During this time, we were gradually unpacking clothes, bedding, and cooking utensils. From the incidents I have related, you may think our lives were rather grim. However, that was not the case. They were happy years. I reached adulthood with a broader base of experience than the average person. We also accumulated a wealth of lifelong friends among the many fine people we came to know and love in each and every congregation we served.
Thank you, Ms. Watson. Let's stop here for a minute and just... Mrs. Watson, would you tell us when your father was born and where?
My father was born in Belleville, Arkansas on March the 26th, 1880. He grew up in this community and married an Arkansas girl and had 4 children. He was local postmaster. He spent a year in New Mexico before moving to Oklahoma in 1918. While working as manager of a company store at Phillips, Oklahoma, he answered the call to the ministry, as I said before, in 1921.
These company stores, what were they? Were they a mining company, or what kind of a store was it?
Phillips, Oklahoma was a mining community, and it was a company store, a mining store, and it was just had everything, just more than just a department store, and he was a manager of this store.
You mentioned that the Ku Klux Klan called on the church one Sunday evening. Can you recall anything else about the visit, how you felt and how the congregation felt about this?
Everyone was just perfectly quiet. They just came in and down the aisle and up to the front, gave Dad the money, said just a word or two and filed out, and everyone was just real calm and I guess frightened, as I remember that I was.
Was there anything else that you'd like to say about the trance when you come up shouting? Did he have these often, or was this just a one-time spirit that moved him?
Yes, he had them quite often. When Dad would get just real filled with the Holy Spirit, he would fall. And as I said, this particular time, Mother would always tell him just to leave him alone. Then she'd start talking to him, say, "Dad, get up and tell them about it." And he'd come up shouting. In fact, my mother shouted quite a lot too. She usually didn't fall in a trance like Daddy, and Daddy didn't every time, but many times he did.
What about the baptismal services that usually are held in a creek or a river? Do you remember anything about these that might be interesting?
Yes, quite often I do recall. Many times I would feel just a little uneasy, wondered if Daddy maybe would try to be baptizing a real heavy-set man maybe, and I'd wondered if he would be able to pull him up, or if he'd fall, or maybe both of them go down in the water. And many of these were held on the creek bank, because at that time we did not have the baptismal founts in the church.
Now, this is all about your father. You know, he's a member of the Masonic Lodge and was mayor of a town in Belleville, Arkansas. Okay.
We had a...
Put that on. Start over there. Mrs. Watson, could you tell us some of the things you recall of your early childhood, please?
During my early childhood, I did not feel, looking back now, that I felt deprived. I felt that we had a very happy family situation. We loved each other, but I do know as I grew up and grew a little older that many times I felt that everyone thought we ought to be different than any of the other young people. And of course, Mother and Dad more or less said that to us, that we should be an example to others. And at that time, when I was a young girl, probably in high school, I might have felt that Father was being a little too strict. But looking back now, I'm just real thankful that he was strict, and I have no regrets.
Ms. Watson, how old was your father when he passed away and when he retired?
Father was 75 when he passed away. He had been retired 4 years. He moved here to Okmulgee, where my husband and I lived, in order to be with us, or near us. After he retired, some very close friends of ours that had been members of the church at Phillips at the time that Dad went into the minster lived at Schulter, and they were members of the Methodist church there. They needed a preacher, and they came up and asked Dad to come down and fill in for them. And Dad preached about a year and a half at Schulter, Oklahoma, after he retired. And the people down there came back and forth and took him to Schulter, to church on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights and even Wednesday nights.
You mentioned here at one time when you were moving from Dustin to Prague that you had a flood and was waterbound for a week. Do you recall this incident any?
Yes, very much so. In fact, this was after my husband and I married, the first year, and we were there at the time. We were just getting ready to move, and we had our things, some of our things there, so we just had to gradually unpack utensils and go to the grocery store and get more food, unpack bedding, and that went on for a week, and then we had to repack, get ready to move again.
Ms. Watson, I believe this concludes our interview. We've been interviewing Ms. Cathelene Watson of Okmulgee, Oklahoma, giving an account of her father, the Reverend J.W. Littlejohn, who was an early day Methodist minister in Oklahoma. And thank you very much.